Welcome to God is Open. I am your host, Christopher Fisher. Today on God is Open, we are going to be talking about the Genesis 6 narrative, going over the story and pointing out some interesting aspects that you may not have noticed upon your first reading. The first thing to keep in mind is that Genesis 6 starts a story that lasts 4 chapters. Now, in a book of the Bible that covers thousands of years of history, spending 4 chapters on the same event, we should take notice. There's something going on in this text. So Genesis 6, we start out, we see that God is in heaven and watching the world. So think about the story of Noah. Think about, as you were taught as a kid, who's the protagonist in this story? Now, the way we were taught, Noah is the protagonist. If you pull up the Hollywood movie Noah, who's the protagonist? It's Noah. They have to invent a lot of things for him to do because when you actually read the text of Genesis 6, Noah is not the protagonist. He's not the person the story's about. He is a side character. He doesn't have volition. He's just drug along. The prime character in the text is actually God. God is the mover. God is the shaker. God has the character development, the character arc. God is doing everything and making things happen. It is God's actions that result in changes within the story. It's God's internal conflict that drives the action. God is the protagonist in the story, and we're going to see that. So I took Genesis 6 and I highlighted all the times God has actions or thoughts or he's part of the narrative. You'll see fairly quickly that he is the main character. He is the protagonist. Genesis 6 begins with angels, what it seems to be angels, interbreeding with human women. And then we are faced with what looks to be an internal monologue by God. My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. And so what does this refer to? Either he is limiting the lifespan of humans to 120 years, or the flood is coming in 120 years. Something of that sort is going on. It's a little bit ambiguous, but we are given an internal narrative of God. God is the watcher. God is the person thinking. God is the focus of this story. There are events happening, and then God reacts to these events. Just a couple of verses later, we see God again looking at the world. And the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and then every intention of his thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Here we have God again acting as the primary protagonist. He's the only person we are introduced to. He is interacting with the surrounding environment. God is watching the world become corrupt. In the next verse, we have the narrator talking about God's internal conflict. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on earth, and it grieved him to his heart. Notice the object of God's regret. The object of God's regret is not, according to the narrator, not because the world has become wicked. It's not sadness over man's wickedness or anything like that. God is blaming himself. God has some sort of internal conflict based on what he's seen. He's regretting his own hand, his own actions in the creation process because of what creation has become. And the next verse emphasizes this. So the Lord said, I will blot out man, whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. Here again, this is one of the few times we have access to God's internal monologue, justifying God's thoughts and God's reactions to events as they unfold. God in this text is the protagonist. So I brought up on the God is Open Facebook group the concept of cognitive dissonance, in which people have internal conflict based on inconsistencies in their thoughts and actions. So cognitive dissonance is the mental anguish one feels when their actions and thoughts hold contradictions. For example, a father might strongly desire his son to play baseball and force him to join a team. The son might be inept or disinterested, and the sport might in fact cause the father to feel anxiety or stress, or just maybe he's a little angry. His son's just not enjoying the sport that he himself, that the father really loves. His visions of a heroic athletic son, they're shattered. When he signed up his child, like he expects his child to be this star athlete and to really love baseball like he did. But he's brought into conflict with the reality when he sees his son on the field not enjoying baseball. Like what he meant for good with his actions, forcing his son to sign up, really has created misery for everyone. The son's miserable, the father's miserable, nobody is winning. So this disconnect between the father's actions and actual results, and the father seeing that and internally trying to wrestle with the results of this action, this is cognitive dissonance. This is the father feeling anxiety over a mismatch between expectations, thoughts, desires, what you want the world to be, how you think the world operates, and how the world actually operates, and then your own actions in creating this current situation. And so what happens with cognitive dissonance? A person might try coping strategies. Maybe the father removes the son from the team. Maybe the father sits the son down and says, hey, let's finish out this season. We'll see, maybe you'll get into it, and maybe you'll like it, and maybe you could choose for the next season if you want to play again. Creating a little bit of hope and a little bit of drive in the son and to continue on and just get through this. Or maybe the father just goes into full mental rationalization mode. Maybe he says, hey, this is the best thing. Even though I'm not having fun, my kid's not having fun, my kid's disinterested, this will be good for him in the long term. And so we're going to just stick it through. I'm just going to keep him in baseball indefinitely. This is mental rationalization. This is coping. This is a strategy for dealing with this cognitive dissonance. All these are coping strategies. You have a conflict between what you've done, what you've caused, what the world is based on what you want it to be, and it causes mental anguish. What the story in Genesis is describing is a very similar mental anguish. God created man for good. Man became wicked. God is regretting his own actions in creating the current state of affairs. This is classic cognitive dissonance. And what is God going to do? God is going to take action to relieve that cognitive dissonance. He is going to destroy the world. Undo creation, undo his act. He's pulling his son out of baseball. He put his son in baseball. Now he regrets it. He regrets his act of putting his son in baseball. He's pulling his son out. He's destroying the world in Genesis 6. This is his mechanism for coping. This is his mechanism for solving that internal anxiety that he himself is responsible for. And you'll notice that this drives the entire narrative of the plot from here on out. This is critical to this story. This internal dialogue, the mental thought process of God. God is the protagonist. We are learning about God. We are growing along with God. We're watching God's character arc. We're watching how God deals with events. He is the prime character and mover. Noah doesn't have volition in the story. He's just pulled along. He has pre-existing righteousness, which grants him some sort of favor in some sense with God. And then he's given commands for survival, which he accepts and he does. But, what are you going to do? Just die? Yeah, no. So Noah's brought along passively throughout this story. He's not given volition. He's not given character. He's not given agency. It's all God. God, throughout all this, is the primary mover, shaker, actor, protagonist of the story. So God resolves to undo his own creation. But then Noah gets found in favor within the eyes of God. And so keep this in mind, that this is after God has decided to destroy the world, then Noah finds favor. And then Noah and the animals are spared on Noah's account. This is repeated in Genesis 9 through 13, the sequence of events. And then we hear a lot more about what God's plans are. Genesis 6:17, for behold, I will bring a flood of waters. God is the primary actor, the agent. He's causing action within the story. His internal thought processes are driving the plot forward. Noah is passive. God says, I will establish my covenant with you. And then it goes on to say that Noah did all God commanded. This is a reoccurring phrase. Noah passively follows God's commands. God has Noah build an ark. He commands him to go into the ark. The animals are brought. It seems that the animals are brought to Noah. Maybe God is leading these animals. It's not quite clear. And then after all that is said and done, God shuts him in the ark. We keep pressing on to Genesis 7:23. God blots out every living thing. Notice again, God is the actor. Why is he doing this? Because it solves his mental anxiety. It solves his blaming himself for the evilness of creation. It solves the problem of evil on earth. But the reason that this is all happening, it was because of that internal deliberation that God had. In Genesis 8, we have God remembering Noah. Remember, Noah's just a passive participant. And so God has to remember Noah is still floating on the ark during the flood. And then God saves him. He causes a wind to blow over the earth. And then he gives him various commands for disembarking. And here's a really critical passage. This is God's covenant with Noah in Genesis 8. Kind of the same phrases are repeated in the next chapter, but this is very interesting. Noah builds an altar to God. He creates some sort of sacrifice. God smells the aroma, and then we get another internal deliberation by God. Remember, God initially was introduced with internal deliberation, which drove the action of the plot. He says, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I again strike down every living creature as I have done. Again, this is more solving cognitive dissonance. God has this disconnect between how he wanted man to be created, how he wanted man to behave, the state that he wanted the world in. Now he's lowering his expectations. Lowered expectations are going to solve this internal anxiety that God has. He understands, yeah, I guess man is just going to be this evil. I should stop caring so much. And in that sense, now that solves his original anxiety, his original internal conflicts. Now he's lowering his standards. He says, neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done. So God blesses Noah and he establishes a covenant, Genesis 9. And very interestingly, he creates a sign. This is a bow that is seen in the clouds, probably a rainbow, right? And this is meant to be a sign that will cause God to recall and remember this covenant. And so this is another, looks like a coping mechanism, which allows God to be reminded from time to time about God's deliberation during this event, how God has handled it, and remind him that no, destroying all of humanity is again off the table, and to remind him about how he felt at the start of this, then through this, and then at the end of this, so that he could put himself into that state of mind again when these types of things reoccur. And he knows that these types of things will reoccur because now he has learned something critical about mankind that he did not know before. It says, when the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. So what this story is telling us is that God has emotions. God can be affected. God has internal deliberations. Sometimes God wants to destroy all of the earth, but he's trying to set up a system such that he will be reminded of the time he did, such that he won't destroy it again. We are given this rare insight into God's internal deliberations and thought processes. So with all this in mind, Genesis 6 becomes a very key passage, Genesis 6:6 and 6:7, because it explains how all these events happened, why all these events happened, and it provides critical plot-making information that drives the narrative for 4 chapters. Without Genesis 6:6 and 6:7, the entire plot falls apart. It's crucial to understanding the context. It's not a throwaway verse to anthropomorphize or something like that and explain away through idiomatic speech. It is the driving action. It is the driving impetus for change. It is part of God's critical character arc within the text. God, who is the protagonist, this is a story about God. It explains why God is, who he is, and what God's history is which have led him to this point. Anyways, questions and comments, leave that down below or start a thread on the God is Open Facebook group. Thank you for listening.